I remember the first time I saw Dr. Evan Lawrence. He sat in a leather armchair in the middle of his bright, book-lined office, projecting a calm and inviting presence, the kind you expect from someone who makes a living untangling other people's pain. When I walked into his office that first day, I was a bundle of nerves, both desperate for help and ashamed of needing it. Evan's steady gaze met mine, and he smiled with a warmth that felt like an invitation. I knew we were meeting as therapist and client, but something in his eyes made it feel like he truly wanted to understand, like he could see beyond my pain and into the person I had been, the person I might still be if things could change. My husband, Michael, hadn't come. He was busy with work, he'd said, or maybe he didn't believe our marriage was really broken enough to need professional intervention. I, on the other hand, had reached a point where every conversation between us felt like a wound, like something raw that wouldn't heal. We were living together, sure, but the distance between us was palpable, long silences, brief exchanges that left me feeling hollow. So here I was, hoping that therapy might save the remnants of our life together. Evan listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer the easy platitudes I'd heard from friends who meant well but didn't understand. As I spoke, the pressure in my chest eased slightly, as if I was finally sharing the weight of everything I'd been carrying for months, maybe even years. He nodded, his expression focused, but there was a softness, too, a hint of sympathy that felt personal. It was more than just professional interest, it felt as if he cared, truly cared, about what I was going through. And when I left that first session, I found myself lingering at the door, feeling an odd reluctance to walk away. I returned the next week, and then the week after that. Our conversations began to shift, little by little. Initially, they were strictly about my marriage, my frustrations, the pain I felt watching Michael drift further and further away. But Evan didn't just focus on my relationship with Michael, he began asking about me, who I was, who I wanted to be. His questions dug deeper than I expected, and I found myself sharing things I hadn't said aloud in years, if ever. One evening, after a particularly intense session where I had confided in him about feeling invisible, not only to Michael but to the world, he said something that sent a shiver through me. "You deserve to be seen," he said, his voice soft but unwavering. His eyes held mine, and for a moment, the room was filled with a tension that neither of us acknowledged. It was a passing moment, or so I told myself, a brief flicker of connection that I was probably reading into because I was so starved for someone to look at me like that. But the weeks went on, and those moments became more frequent. I'd find his gaze lingering on me just a second too long, and I couldn't help but feel drawn to him in ways that made me question my motives. He was attentive, present, a calm presence that made me feel whole again, even if just for an hour. One afternoon, as he closed the notebook where he jotted down our sessions, he smiled. It wasn't the polite, professional smile he'd always given me, it was warmer, almost vulnerable. When I asked him about his life, he was cautious at first. But over time, he opened up, sharing small details about his background, his love for music, the solitude he often felt after work. As his words painted a picture of his life, I realized how much I looked forward to these glimpses, these subtle cracks in the professional facade that hinted at the man behind the therapist. One night, after a session that had stretched well past our usual time, we ended up sitting in his office in silence, the quiet around us growing heavier by the second. I could feel his presence next to me, every breath he took. He reached out, placing a hand over mine. "You're not alone," he whispered, and something inside me broke. I hadn't felt connected to anyone like this in years, maybe ever. His hand on mine felt grounding, real, like a lifeline I hadn't known I needed. At that moment, I realized I wasn't just there to save my marriage anymore. I was there because I needed him, this connection, this feeling that there was someone who saw me for who I was, not who I'd become in the wake of a failing relationship. And as wrong as it felt, I found myself craving his presence, his attention, in ways that frightened me. From then on, our sessions changed. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a recognition of the connection that was growing, no matter how hard we tried to ignore it. I found myself dressing differently, paying more attention to my appearance, as if each session was a chance to be seen through his eyes, to feel beautiful, understood. His gaze would follow me as I spoke, and the warmth in his eyes made me feel as though I was the only person in the world. One evening, as the sun set outside his office window, he walked me to the door, as he always did. But this time, he paused. I looked up at him, searching his face for a sign that he felt the same pull, the same impossible magnetism that I couldn't deny. His hand brushed against mine, and in that split second, I knew we were on the brink of something that would change everything. He began, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply looked at me, his expression raw, unguarded. I took a shaky breath, stepping back, feeling the weight of everything that hadn't been said pressing down on us. I wanted to ask him if he felt it too, if he was as terrified as I was, but I couldn't bring myself to break the silence. We said our goodbyes that night, but I left his office feeling as though a part of me had stayed behind. I knew I was standing on the edge of a decision that could change my life, and yet I found myself returning, week after week, unable to let go of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I had finally found what I'd been searching for all along. Evan and I never spoke directly about what was happening between us, but it was there, simmering just beneath the surface, a quiet intensity that made every conversation, every glance charged with unspoken meaning. I knew I was crossing lines, risking everything I had built, but each time I thought about stepping back, I felt the hollowness of my life without him. He had become my confidant, my anchor, and in a way, the person who made me feel alive. The sessions continued, and with each one, I felt myself drifting further from my old life, from the woman who had walked into his office desperate to save a marriage that had been slipping away for years. I had come searching for answers, but instead, I had found something I hadn't known I needed, a connection, a sense of being seen, of being understood in ways that went beyond words. And as I sat across from him, week after week, I began to wonder if this fragile, complicated bond, was worth everything I might lose. After that evening, I couldn't deny the feelings that had started to grow within me, spreading like roots in the cracks of everything I thought I knew about myself. I wanted to believe that what I felt was just a temporary fascination, a fleeting distraction from the emptiness in my marriage. But with each session, I grew more certain that what was happening between Evan and me was not something I could simply will away. In those silent minutes after our sessions, when he'd walk me to the door, the air between us felt almost thick, charged with all the things we weren't saying. The tension was both exhilarating and terrifying, a line we balanced on carefully, neither of us daring to move too far one way or the other. At home, Michael barely noticed the changes in me. If he saw the new clothes, the softer shades of lipstick I chose with a nervous flutter before each session, he said nothing. If he sensed my absence when I disappeared into my thoughts, he never asked where my mind wandered. I'd lie next to him at night, listening to his breathing, but I felt 1,000 miles away. Our lives were parallel, two separate worlds that didn't touch anymore. One evening, Michael came home late from work, his face set in the expression of weary indifference that had become his new normal. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, words that filled the air but meant nothing. Then, without thinking, I asked him something I hadn't dared to bring up in a long time. "Do you think we're happy, Michael?" The question felt like a pebble thrown into still water, creating ripples that I couldn't control. He looked up, surprised, as if the question had come from someone else entirely. For a moment, I saw a flash of something in his eyes, but it quickly faded, replaced by the usual guarded distance. "I think we're fine, aren't we?" he said, his voice flat, almost robotic. "Fine isn't the same as happy," I whispered, feeling the weight of those words settle heavily in the room. But he didn't respond, just shrugged and went back to his phone, as if I hadn't spoken at all. I felt an ache, the familiar loneliness creeping in again, and I thought of Evan, of the way he looked at me with that gentle understanding that felt more real than anything I had with Michael. The next time I saw Evan, he seemed different. He was as warm as ever, but there was a restraint in him, something holding him back. I noticed him glancing down at his notes more often than usual, as if he needed to remind himself of his role. I knew I should have been grateful for his professionalism, his clear attempts to maintain boundaries, but instead, it left me with a hollow feeling. I craved his attention, his closeness. I wanted him to look at me the way he had before, with that unspoken connection that made me feel alive. Halfway through the session, I couldn't take it anymore. I let out a shaky breath, feeling my hands tremble slightly. "Evan," I began, my voice barely above a whisper, "have you ever felt something for a client? Something beyond just concern?" He looked at me, his face a mixture of surprise and something else I couldn't quite place. He hesitated, glancing down at his hands. "It's complicated," he finally said, his voice careful, almost rehearsed. "I think it's natural to feel empathy, especially in situations where someone is in pain. We're all human, after all." But there was something in his voice, a slight tremor that betrayed him. I looked down, feeling a rush of shame mixed with hope. "I don't mean empathy," I said softly. "I mean, feeling something that goes beyond that." Evan's hand clenched, his knuckles turning white. He took a deep breath, meeting my gaze with a raw intensity that made my heart pound. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us speaking louder than any words could. It felt as though the room had shrunk, as if we were the only two people in the world. He began, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He cleared it, his gaze shifting away as he gathered his thoughts. "I think, sometimes connections happen that we can't always explain," he said, his voice quiet. "But we have to be careful. We have to remember why we're here." His words were a reminder, a line drawn in the sand, but the look in his eyes told a different story. I felt an undeniable pull, a magnetic force that was drawing me closer, tempting me to cross that line. And in that moment, I realized that my need for him went beyond therapy, beyond what I'd come here for in the first place. I needed him, not just as a therapist, but as something more, something I couldn't quite define, but that I knew was dangerously close to love. After that session, I lay awake for hours, my mind replaying every word, every glance we'd exchanged. I felt both exhilarated and terrified, as if I were teetering on the edge of a cliff, staring into an unknown future. I knew that what was happening was wrong, that I was risking everything I'd built, but I couldn't turn back. I felt trapped, caught between the life I had and the life I wanted, and Evan was the only person who made me feel whole, understood. The following weeks passed in a blur. Each session felt like a dance, a delicate balance of restraint and longing. We skirted around the boundaries, both of us aware of the unspoken connection that was growing stronger with each meeting. And yet, we never crossed that line, never acknowledged what was simmering beneath the surface. One evening, as I was preparing to leave his office, he stood by the door, watching me with an intensity that made my heart race. I felt a surge of courage, a sudden need to finally acknowledge what was happening between us. I took a step closer, closing the space between us, feeling the heat of his presence. "Evan," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I can't pretend anymore. I need you. Not as my therapist, but as something more." He looked at me, his expression a mixture of longing and hesitation. For a moment, I thought he might pull away, remind me of the boundaries we'd set. But instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a spark through me, a rush of emotion that I couldn't control. "I feel it too," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "But we can't." His words hung in the air, unfinished, as if he were battling with himself. But then, in a moment of weakness, he closed the distance between us, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was both gentle and fierce, filled with all the longing we had kept bottled up. It was a release, a surrender to everything we'd been holding back, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. We pulled away, both of us breathless, the reality of what we'd done sinking in. But I didn't feel regret. For the first time in years, I felt alive, as though I'd finally found a piece of myself that had been missing. And as I looked into his eyes, I knew that this was only the beginning of something that would change everything. After that night, things couldn't go back to the way they were. Our sessions took on a new intimacy, a depth that went beyond therapy. We spent hours talking, sharing parts of ourselves that we had kept hidden from the world. He became my confidant, my escape, the person who saw me in ways no one else ever had. And in return, I felt myself falling deeper, unable to stop the tide of emotions that had overtaken me. But as the weeks passed, I began to feel the weight of what we were doing. I was still married, still bound to a life that felt increasingly hollow. And though Evan and I shared something real, something undeniable, there was a part of me that felt guilty, torn between my desire for him and the promises I had made to Michael. One evening, as I sat alone in our darkened bedroom, I realized that I couldn't keep living a double life. I had to make a choice, to face the consequences of what I'd done. I knew that I couldn't have both, that I would have to let go of one life to fully embrace the other. And as I lay there, my heart aching with the weight of my decision, I knew that my life would never be the same. In the days that followed, I felt as though I was drifting through my own life, watching from the outside as I went through the motions, each one more hollow than the last. My relationship with Michael had become a facade, a structure held together by routine and habit but devoid of warmth or real connection. Every conversation felt forced, every shared moment tainted by the knowledge of what I was hiding. I was there physically, but my heart was elsewhere, in a small, quiet office that had become my only sanctuary. Evan and I had agreed not to contact each other outside of our sessions, but that rule became harder to follow with each passing day. I found myself glancing at my phone, hoping to see his name flash across the screen, knowing it wouldn't but aching for it nonetheless. In the empty spaces of my life, I thought of him constantly, his voice, his touch, the way he looked at me with a tenderness I hadn't known in years. I knew I couldn't go on like this, living in fragments, torn between two worlds. One night, as I lay awake next to Michael, I found myself rehearsing the words I knew I needed to say. I needed to tell him the truth, to end the charade and finally allow myself to be free, even if it meant tearing apart everything we'd built. But as I looked at his sleeping face, memories flooded my mind, the early days of our marriage, the laughter we'd once shared, the dreams we'd built together. Part of me still wanted to believe that we could find our way back, that the love we'd once had could somehow survive this storm. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about Michael. This was about me, about the parts of myself I had lost along the way. My affair with Evan wasn't just an escape, it was a reflection of everything I'd been missing, everything I hadn't even realized I needed until I met him. I wanted to be seen, to be known, and with him, I felt whole in a way I hadn't in years. Still, the decision weighed on me like a shadow, filling me with both dread and longing. When I arrived at Evan's office for our next session, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and fear. I knew I needed to tell him what I'd been thinking, to finally put words to the decision that had been haunting me. He greeted me with a soft smile, his gaze warm and reassuring, but as I sat down, I could see a flicker of worry in his eyes. "What's on your mind?" he asked gently, his voice steady but laced with a hint of tension. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. "Evan," I began, my voice barely above a whisper, "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep living in two worlds. It's tearing me apart." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I understand," he said softly, his gaze holding mine with a quiet intensity. "I've been thinking about it too. I don't want to make things harder for you, and I never wanted to be the cause of your pain." For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of our words hanging heavily between us. I could feel the tears welling up, the emotion I'd been holding back threatening to spill over. "I don't regret any of this," I whispered, my voice shaking. "But I don't know how to move forward. I feel like I'm losing myself, like I'm caught between the person I used to be and the person I want to become." He reached out, taking my hand in his touch grounding me, filling me with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in weeks. "Maybe you're not losing yourself," he said quietly. "Maybe you're finding who you really are." His words struck a chord deep within me, a truth that resonated in ways I couldn't fully explain. For so long, I had defined myself by my marriage, by the life I'd built with Michael, but with Evan, I'd started to see a different version of myself, a version I wanted to embrace, even if it meant letting go of the past. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I knew what I had to do. The decision settled within me like a calm certainty, a quiet resolve that made the coming confrontation inevitable. I waited for Michael to come home from work, rehearsing my words, preparing myself for the pain I was about to cause. When he walked through the door, I felt my heart race, the fear and guilt swirling inside me, but I forced myself to stay steady. "Michael, we need to talk," I said, my voice trembling but determined. He looked at me, surprised, sensing the seriousness in my tone. For the first time in what felt like months, I saw a flicker of emotion in his eyes, a hint of vulnerability that made my heart ache. We sat down across from each other, the silence stretching between us as I gathered the courage to speak. "I don't know how else to say this, but I don't think we're happy, Michael. I don't think we've been happy for a long time." My voice broke slightly, but I pushed on, knowing that I needed to be honest, that I owed him the truth. "I think we've been holding on to something that isn't there anymore, and it's tearing us both apart." He looked away, his jaw tense, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. I could see the pain in his eyes, the silent struggle as he tried to process my words. "Is there someone else?" he asked finally, his voice barely audible. I hesitated, the weight of the truth heavy on my shoulders. I knew that telling him would hurt, that it would shatter the fragile peace we'd managed to maintain. But I couldn't lie to him, not anymore. "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "There is." For a moment, he said nothing, the silence between us thick with unspoken emotion. I could see the pain in his eyes, the betrayal, the hurt, and I felt a pang of guilt so deep it threatened to consume me. But even in that moment, I knew that this was the right choice, that I couldn't keep living a life that felt like a lie. "I didn't want this, Michael," I said softly, my voice choked with emotion. "I didn't want to hurt you. But I can't keep pretending. I need something more." He looked away, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, I thought he might say something, might try to hold on to what we had. But then he simply nodded, his gaze distant, as if he were already letting go. The days that followed were a blur of painful conversations, of packing boxes and empty spaces that reminded me of the life we'd shared. Saying goodbye was harder than I had expected, a slow unraveling of the years we'd built together. There were moments when I questioned myself, when I wondered if I was making a terrible mistake, but then I would think of Evan, of the quiet understanding we shared, and I knew that I was on the path I was meant to follow. Once I was settled into my new life, a small apartment not far from Evan's office, I felt a sense of freedom, a lightness that was both exhilarating and terrifying. For the first time in years, I was on my own, navigating a life that was entirely my own. But even as I embraced this new beginning, I couldn't shake the lingering doubts, the fear that I had given up something real for a chance at something that might not last. Evan and I continued to see each other, our relationship evolving beyond the confines of his office, blossoming into something real, something that filled me with a sense of hope I hadn't felt in years. We spent quiet evenings together, sharing parts of ourselves that had been hidden for so long, finding comfort in each other's presence. But as the months went on, I began to feel a subtle shift between us, a quiet tension that crept into our conversations, into the moments of silence that once felt so natural. I wondered if he, too, was feeling the weight of what we had done, the enormity of the choices we'd made. There were times when he seemed distant, his gaze troubled, as if he were lost in thoughts he couldn't share. One evening, as we sat together on my small couch, I felt a pang of uncertainty, a fear that I couldn't shake. "Evan," I said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence between us, "do you ever regret this? Us?" He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of doubt, a hint of the struggle he was hiding. But then he smiled, reaching out to take my hand. "No," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet conviction. "I don't regret any of it. Being with you, it's what I've wanted all along." His words were reassuring, a balm to the fear that had been growing inside me, but as I lay awake that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, that the foundation we'd built was beginning to crack. As time passed, my life with Evan settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural, but there was an undercurrent of tension that neither of us spoke about. We spent weekends together, cooked dinner in my tiny kitchen, and shared conversations late into the night that made me feel understood in ways I'd once thought were impossible. He became my confidant, my partner, someone who knew every part of me. But even in those quiet, intimate moments, a small voice in the back of my mind reminded me that we'd built this relationship on complicated ground. One evening, as we sat on my couch, Evan seemed quieter than usual. He was scrolling absently through his phone, his face clouded by something I couldn't quite read. I reached out, placing my hand over his. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice soft, trying not to betray the anxiety creeping into my chest. He looked up, offering me a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah. I'm fine," he said, squeezing my hand. But I could tell he was holding something back. There was a distance in his gaze, a flicker of worry that he wasn't sharing with me. I wanted to push, to ask him what was wrong, but I didn't. I was afraid of what he might say. In the weeks that followed, that tension only grew. Evan's work seemed to consume him more and more. There were times when he'd have to cancel plans last minute, citing appointments that had run late or emergencies that couldn't wait. I understood, his career was demanding, and I respected his commitment to his clients. But as the cancellations became more frequent, I began to feel the sting of loneliness creeping back in, a reminder of the days when I'd felt invisible in my own marriage. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, the silence around me felt suffocating. My mind drifted back to Michael, to the home we'd once shared, to the comfort of routine, even if it had come at the cost of true happiness. I had chosen this life, a life filled with passion and uncertainty, but there were moments when I questioned if I had been prepared for the reality of it. I had left a stable, predictable existence for something that now felt tenuous, fragile. When Evan finally called, I picked up immediately, my heart racing with anticipation. But as soon as I heard his voice, I knew something was wrong. He sounded distant, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry for being so unavailable lately," he said. "Work has been a lot, and I know I haven't been here for you the way I should be." "It's okay," I said, forcing a lightness into my tone that I didn't feel. "I know you're busy." But he sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. "No, it's not okay. You deserve someone who can be fully present, someone who can give you the attention you need. And I don't want you to feel like I'm slipping away." My chest tightened at his words, a wave of fear washing over me. "Are you slipping away?" I asked, barely able to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, a silence that felt unbearable. "I don't want to," he said finally. "But I'm realizing how complicated this is, for both of us. I love being with you, but I worry that, maybe we rushed into this. Maybe we got caught up in the excitement and didn't think about the challenges." I felt a stab of hurt, a pang of rejection that went deeper than I'd anticipated. "So what are you saying?" I asked, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay calm. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice soft, almost pleading. I need some time to think, to figure out if I can give you what you deserve. I want to be fair to you, but I don't want to make promises I can't keep." I sat there, stunned, unable to find the words. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, to remind him of everything we'd gone through to be together. But another part of me understood. We had both jumped into this relationship, driven by passion and a shared need for connection. But now, faced with the reality of our choices, we were both starting to feel the weight of what we'd risked. Over the next few weeks, Evan pulled back. Our conversations became shorter, our time together less frequent. I found myself replaying every word we'd shared, every promise he'd made, wondering if I'd misread him, if I'd let myself believe in something that had never really been there. The life I'd imagined with him, the future I'd started to build in my mind, began to feel like a mirage, something I'd conjured up in the haze of my loneliness and need. One evening, as I was organizing some old boxes in my apartment, I came across a photo album from my life with Michael. Flipping through the pictures, I was struck by the smiles, the laughter we'd once shared. It was easy to forget, in the haze of resentment and disappointment, that we'd had good moments too. There were times when he'd made me laugh until my sides hurt, moments when I'd felt safe, loved. For the first time in months, I wondered if I'd been too hasty, if I'd allowed myself to be swept away by the allure of something new and exciting without truly considering what I was leaving behind. I'd been so desperate to escape the numbness, to feel alive again, that I hadn't thought about the consequences, about the lives I was affecting. And yet, even as those doubts crept in, I couldn't deny the way Evan had made me feel, the way he'd looked at me, listened to me, made me believe in a version of myself that I'd long forgotten. He had awakened something inside me, something that felt too real to dismiss, even as our relationship was slipping through my fingers. Days turned into weeks, and I heard less and less from Evan. It was as if he were fading from my life, a gradual, painful withdrawal that left me feeling hollow, empty. I found myself going through the motions, each day blending into the next, the excitement and passion that had once defined my life now replaced by a numbness that was all too familiar. One night, unable to bear the silence any longer, I sent him a message, asking if we could meet, if we could talk about what was happening between us. The hours ticked by, my phone silent, each passing moment a reminder of the distance that had grown between us. When he finally replied, his message was brief, detached. "Let's talk tomorrow," he'd written. "I think it's time we figure out what's next." I spent the night in a haze of anxiety, torn between hope and dread, wondering if this conversation would be the end of everything we'd shared. When the morning finally came, I felt as though I were moving through a dream, my steps heavy, my mind foggy with fear. I knew, deep down, that this was a turning point, that whatever happened next would define not only our relationship but my life as a whole. When I arrived at his office, he was waiting for me, his expression somber, his gaze avoiding mine. I could feel the tension in the air, the weight of everything we'd left unsaid hanging between us. We sat down, the silence stretching, each of us waiting for the other to speak. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with a sadness I hadn't seen before. "I've thought about this a lot," he began, his voice quiet, steady. "About us, about everything that's happened. And as much as I care about you, I think, maybe we were trying to fill spaces that couldn't be filled by each other. We were both searching for something, but maybe, we got lost along the way." The words cut deeper than I'd expected, a knife twisting in a wound I hadn't even realized was there. I wanted to protest, to tell him that what we had was real, that he'd given me hope, made me believe in love again. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw the truth, a truth I hadn't been willing to face. We'd been two broken people, drawn together by a shared longing, but maybe we'd been trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. "I don't regret anything we shared," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "But I think it's time for both of us to find our own paths, to figure out who we are outside of this escape we created." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, a mixture of sadness and relief flooding me as I realized that he was right. We'd been clinging to each other, using our relationship as a lifeline, but in the end, we couldn't outrun the truth. We had both been searching for something that no one else could give us, a sense of completeness, of wholeness that had to come from within. As we said our goodbyes, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a quiet acceptance of the ending that was both painful and liberating. I walked out of his office, feeling the weight of our relationship lifting, leaving me with a bittersweet freedom that filled me with a new sense of purpose. In the days that followed, I began to rebuild my life piece by piece, rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried beneath years of compromise and loneliness. I threw myself into my work, reconnected with friends, started exploring interests I'd long abandoned. It wasn't easy, and there were nights when the loneliness felt overwhelming, when I longed for the comfort of Evan. Or the familiar, steady presence of Michael. But each time that ache crept in, I reminded myself that this loneliness was different. It wasn't the hollow emptiness I'd felt for so long in my marriage, nor was it the dizzying rush of dependence I'd felt with Evan. It was a quiet solitude, one I was beginning to accept, even find peace within. Months passed, and slowly, my life began to feel like my own again. I started to enjoy the small rituals of independence, choosing how to spend my evenings, rediscovering books I'd abandoned, learning to sit with myself without the distraction of someone else's presence. I found a strange sense of power in this autonomy, a strength I hadn't realized I possessed. Every so often, I'd think of Michael and wonder how he was. In our final days together, I'd sensed a glimmer of regret in him, as though he'd recognized too late that he had let something precious slip away. But we hadn't spoken since the divorce, and part of me knew it was better that way. I needed this time to rebuild, to learn who I was outside of the roles I'd played for so many years. I wanted to be someone whole, someone complete on my own, rather than someone waiting to be rescued or defined by another person's love. Evan's memory lingered, too, like a ghost that visited me in quiet moments. There were nights when I'd close my eyes and remember the warmth of his touch, the way he'd made me feel seen and understood. I didn't regret my time with him. He'd been a spark that reignited something inside me. But I'd come to realize that he hadn't been the answer to my problems. He'd been a mirror, showing me the parts of myself I'd neglected, the longings I'd buried. And in that sense, he'd given me a gift, one I was only now beginning to understand. One evening, months after I'd last seen Evan, I found myself walking through the park where he and I had once met on a chilly autumn afternoon, a memory that now felt distant, like a scene from someone else's life. The leaves were beginning to turn, the air filled with the crisp, nostalgic scent of fall. I sat on a bench, pulling my coat around me, and watched as families walked by, couples hand in hand, people moving through their own lives with a quiet purpose. I took a deep breath, feeling the peace of the moment settle around me. For the first time in years, I wasn't yearning for someone's presence, wasn't looking for a sense of completeness outside myself. I was simply here, present, content in my own skin. The loneliness that had once haunted me was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt solid, a sense of belonging that I had found within myself. As the months turned into a year, I continued to grow, to explore, to fill my life with meaning that came from within. I started volunteering at a local community center, helping young women who were struggling to find their way. I saw parts of myself in their stories, the uncertainty, the yearning, the search for validation in others, and I found fulfillment in helping them navigate those difficult waters. In guiding them, I was, in a way, guiding myself, finding closure in the lessons I was able to share. One afternoon, after a particularly long day at the center, I stopped at a small cafe for a cup of tea. As I waited for my order, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned, surprised to see Michael standing there, looking just as taken aback as I felt. His face had softened, the lines around his eyes deeper, a hint of humility in his expression that I hadn't seen before. "Wow, I didn't expect to see you here," he said, offering me a tentative smile. "Neither did I replied, my heart racing as a mixture of emotions flooded me, nostalgia, curiosity, a hint of the old affection that had once bound us. We stood there awkwardly for a moment before he gestured to an empty table. Would you like to sit down?" I hesitated, then nodded, following him to the table and settling into the familiar, yet foreign, rhythm of his presence. We made small talk at first, catching up on life, work, the changes we'd each been through. But as the conversation drifted, I began to sense a vulnerability in him, a desire to say something that went beyond pleasantries. "I've thought about you a lot," he admitted finally, his gaze steady but filled with regret. "About everything that happened. I didn't realize how much I'd taken for granted, until it was too late." His words struck a chord in me, a pang of sadness for what we'd lost, for the version of us that had once believed in forever. But as I looked at him, I felt a sense of clarity, a realization that I was no longer tied to the past, that I had moved beyond it. "We were both trying to find something," I said softly, choosing my words carefully. "And I think, maybe we just didn't know how to be honest with each other, or with ourselves." He nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I wish I'd understood that sooner. Maybe things would have been different." "Maybe," I replied, feeling a bittersweet acceptance settle over me. "But maybe this is exactly where we were meant to end up." We parted with a quiet understanding, a sense of closure that felt freeing, like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally lifted. As I walked away, I didn't feel the lingering sadness I'd expected, the ache of regret. Instead, I felt a deep, abiding gratitude, for the lessons, for the growth, for the person I'd become in the aftermath of our shared mistakes. In the months that followed, I embraced my life with an openness I hadn't felt in years. I traveled to places I'd always wanted to see, made new friends, pursued passions I'd once brushed aside. And through it all, I carried with me the quiet strength I had discovered, the self-assurance that came from knowing I was enough on my own. One evening, as I was returning from a trip to a nearby town, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Evan. I hadn't heard from him since our last conversation, and seeing his name brought a flood of memories and emotions that I hadn't expected. The message was simple, unassuming. Hi. I just wanted to reach out and see how you've been. I hope you're well. I stared at the message, my heart pounding as a mix of curiosity and nostalgia washed over me. I took a deep breath, my fingers hovering over the screen as I considered my response. In that moment, I realized that I no longer needed his validation, his understanding, to feel whole. I was grateful for what he'd brought into my life, for the way he'd helped me rediscover myself. But I didn't need to return to the past to move forward. After a moment, I typed a response. Hi, Evan. I'm doing well, thank you. I hope you are too. I hit send, feeling a sense of closure, a quiet peace that filled the spaces once occupied by longing and uncertainty. I knew that this was the final chapter, the end of a story that had helped me grow, but one that no longer defined me. And as I stepped into my quiet apartment that night, I felt a deep, abiding contentment, a sense of being exactly where I was meant to be. I was alone, but I was whole, complete, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly at peace. The weeks that followed Evan's message passed like chapters in a book whose story I was finally writing for myself. For the first time in years, I felt as though I was fully in control of my life, no longer seeking answers in someone else's gaze, no longer waiting for validation from anyone but myself. There was a peace that came with this independence, a sense of self-reliance that filled me with a quiet joy, a freedom I hadn't known I craved. But even with this newfound confidence, life had a way of reminding me that growth wasn't linear, that moving forward sometimes meant looking back and learning from the past with fresh eyes. One crisp autumn afternoon, as I was organizing my apartment, I found a small box tucked away at the back of my closet. Inside were mementos from my old life, photos with Michael from our early years together, letters we'd exchanged, small trinkets that once meant the world to me. I ran my fingers over a picture of us smiling on a summer vacation, our eyes bright with hope for a future we'd never quite managed to reach. A bittersweet feeling washed over me, a reminder of everything we'd shared, the dreams we'd once held in our hands. But as I looked at those memories, I didn't feel regret or loss. Instead, I felt gratitude for the woman I'd been, the love we'd once shared, even if it hadn't lasted. I was able to appreciate those moments without feeling tied to them, without longing for something that no longer existed. It was a strange and liberating feeling, to cherish those memories while knowing they were part of a life I had outgrown. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the sun dip below the city skyline, my phone buzzed with a message from Sarah, an old friend I hadn't seen in years. She was hosting a small dinner party that weekend and wanted to know if I'd like to join. For a moment, I hesitated. The last time I'd seen Sarah, I'd been a very different person, still defined by my roles as a wife, a partner, someone constantly searching for answers outside of herself. I wondered how it would feel to reconnect, to show up as this new version of myself, independent and whole. But then, with a small smile, I typed back an enthusiastic yes, feeling a spark of excitement at the thought of reuniting with people who had known me before everything had changed. I wanted to share my journey, not as a confession but as a celebration of the woman I had become, to surround myself with people who knew my story and could appreciate the growth I'd undergone. When Saturday night arrived, I dressed with a confidence that felt almost foreign, choosing an outfit that made me feel both elegant and empowered. As I entered Sarah's cozy apartment, filled with the warm scent of spices and the laughter of friends, I felt a sense of belonging that went deeper than I'd expected. Sarah greeted me with a hug, her eyes lighting up as she took me in. "You look amazing," she said, a hint of surprise in her voice. "It's been too long." We spent the evening catching up, laughing over old memories, sharing stories of our lives, the ups and downs, the moments of doubt and resilience. It felt freeing to share my story without shame, to talk about the struggles and heartbreaks, the choices I'd made that had brought me to this point. As I spoke, I saw understanding in their eyes, a sense of camaraderie that reminded me of the power of true friendship, of connections that remained even as life pulled us in different directions. By the end of the night, I felt a deep gratitude for the people who had once been part of my life, for the way they accepted me without question, without judgment. I realized that in my journey toward independence, I had sometimes closed myself off, afraid that opening up meant giving up my hard-won autonomy. But this evening reminded me that sharing my life, my struggles and victories, didn't make me weaker or dependent, it simply made me human. As I walked home that night under a blanket of stars, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment not only to myself but to the people who had stood by me, who had accepted me at every stage of my journey. Life wasn't about closing doors, it was about choosing which doors to keep open, which relationships to nurture, which connections truly brought me joy. In the months that followed, I continued to grow, to embrace this new chapter with an open heart. I began teaching a few workshops at the community center, sharing my experiences with women who, like me, were seeking direction, strength, a sense of self. I found fulfillment in guiding others, in helping them see their own worth, their own potential for transformation. Then, one chilly winter evening, I received an unexpected call. It was Evan. "Hey," he said, his voice soft, familiar, carrying a note of uncertainty. "I hope this isn't too sudden, but I wanted to reach out. I've thought about you often, Anne. I realized there were things I never said. I'd like to see you, if you're open to it." My heart raced at the sound of his voice, a surge of emotions flooding me. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to dive back into that connection that had once meant so much. But another part of me paused, a small voice within reminding me of the woman I had become, of everything I'd built since our paths had diverged. "I'm open to it," I replied, my voice calm, steady. "But I think it's important that we're clear about what we're looking for, Evan. I've changed, and I don't want to go back to the person I was." He was silent for a moment, as if considering my words. "I understand," he said finally. "I think I've changed too. I'd just like the chance to talk, to see where we stand." We agreed to meet the following weekend at a quiet cafe, a place we'd once gone together during those early days when everything between us had felt new and charged with possibility. As I waited for him, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a sense of readiness to face whatever came next, whether it was closure or a new beginning. When he walked in, I was struck by how familiar he looked, yet how different I felt. He greeted me with a gentle smile, his eyes soft but searching, as though he, too, was seeing me in a new light. We talked for hours, revisiting the past, acknowledging the mistakes we'd made, the ways we'd hurt each other unintentionally. But this time, there was no bitterness, no regret, only a shared understanding of the lessons we'd learned. As the afternoon wore on, I realized that the bond we shared was real, but it didn't need to define me. I could love him in a way that was freeing, without the need to possess or control. Our connection was something I could cherish without making it the center of my world. By the time we said goodbye, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that I could care for someone deeply without losing myself in the process. As I walked home, I felt the warmth of a new chapter unfolding, a chapter one was writing with intention, with clarity. I knew there would be more challenges, more days of doubt and uncertainty, but I felt prepared to face them, secure in the knowledge that I was capable, whole, complete in my own right. Over time, I continued to build a life filled with purpose, connection, and self-respect. I found joy in the small moments, in the friendships I had rekindled, in the simple pleasure of being fully present in my own life. I realized that happiness wasn't about finding someone to complete me, it was about becoming whole on my own and then choosing to share that completeness with others in meaningful, intentional ways. Years later, looking back on that time in my life, I would remember it as the season that taught me the value of true self-discovery. It was a journey marked by heartbreak and healing, by mistakes and forgiveness, but most importantly, it was the journey that had led me back to myself. And in the end, that was the greatest love story of all, the story of a woman learning to love herself, to trust her own heart, and to embrace the beautiful, messy, unpredictable path that is life.